Welcome. I'm Paige Stover here today with Dr. Kathryn Seifert. Dr. Seifert is the originator of a new model called the FRISC risk reduction model to identify violent behavior in children and adults, I believe.
Children and adults, correct.
In your model, Dr. Seifert, you have identified 3 types of killers or 3 types of violent propensities for violence. Can you fill us in on how you've evolved this?
I would love to. And so my research is showing that not all violent people are the same. We actually have 3 groups. One group we've known about for a very long time and everybody's very familiar with. And these are the chronically violent youth. They start as young people right through adulthood and continue to be violent with their families and their communities. And so we're all familiar with them. They're involved with criminal justice, and an example of that might be Eileen Wuornos out of Canada, who killed 7 men, and she had been involved in the criminal justice system and was a chronic killer, a serial killer. So in looking at recent events of mass murder that have happened over the last 2 or 3 years, what has become clear is that there's a second group. And I think we're not as familiar with this group, and so I'm calling this group eruptors. And here's the reason why. These are not people that have been arrested for prior violent acts. They have been emotionally unstable in the past, but they really have not committed previous acts of violence. This eruptor group tend to be, as a description, psychotic, not in touch with reality, paranoid, delusional, narcissistic, and not in treatment, and not receiving the amount of support that they need to solve problems.
What would be some examples of these eruptors, as you call them?
Well, I think many of the mass murders that we've had in the last couple of years. Adam Lanza certainly was an eruptor. James Holmes was an eruptor. And as with both of these, they're very bright. But they have very severe mental illness and they're not in treatment. Aaron Alexis, the DC Navy Yard shooter, was psychotic and very bright, but he wasn't getting treatment for the very paranoid disorder that he had. And so he took his guns and took care of problems that should have been solved in another way.
In your typology, you talk about the chronic group and the eruptor group, but then you also point out that for them to take action, there's some sort of a flashpoint that causes them to snap.
Right, and so hence the name of FRISC. The flashpoint becomes they may have had difficulties along for years, but then there comes an event that is so injuring of their ego. They feel like their whole world is going to fall apart. It's not something that would be a flashpoint for you or me because we can manage difficult situations, but for them, they feel like their whole world is falling apart. It becomes a flashpoint, and the only way they can see to manage this is the end of my life kind of event, is to go out and take revenge on other people.
So in the Aaron Alexis Washington Navy Yard case, what was his flashpoint?
He had been having difficulties with his employment and his contractual work with the military and the Navy, and so his anger and not being able to resolve some of the payment problems and things he had had with the Navy just built up, and he hit a point where he was volunteering work and not able to find sufficient employment. And that became his flashpoint, because for men, very often they define themselves by their employment. And if that doesn't go well, that becomes a flashpoint. So his flashpoint actually was having difficulty with his employment.
And I think I read he got a negative performance appraisal.
Correct.
Or something.
Right. And that very often can be a flashpoint, because to be appraised negatively, that injures the ego deeply.
How about the Boston Marathon killers? I actually live in Boston, so that's one that's very close to me. What category do you put those two guys in, and what was their flashpoint?
Well, they weren't chronic. Neither of them had chronic violence. However, the older one,
the one who's now dead,
the one who's now dead, actually they found some writings and people who knew him, and they believe he was psychotic. And in addition to that, he came from the Caucasus, where there's lots of clash of cultures in terms of power structures, male power structures. And so he actually had some elements of both a power structure and an eruptor. So he had some psychosis, he had some cultural features of the power structure murderer, and so his flashpoint was that he was a boxer, and he actually wanted to be on the Olympic team, but he had never become a citizen. And when he was rejected for being on the Olympic team, that became his flashpoint.
I see. So he wanted to be on the United States Olympic team. I see.
But he could not be. He didn't bother to become a citizen.
I see.
But rather than going back and becoming a citizen, which would be a logical kind of way, because his brain didn't work properly, he saw revenge as a way to do that. But being brought up in the Caucasus, that was a way of life over there.
What about the Virginia Tech shooter?
Sen-Wei Cho had mental health difficulties from the time he was 5 years old. He, in his early life, was very protected. He had mental health services. The school provided a protective social network around him, and he actually did well. The information was not passed on to his college. It was recommended that he go to a small college. He insisted that he go to a large college. So he did not have this protective social support system around him. He was selectively mute, which meant there were times when he did not talk. You could prod him, you could ask him, you could cajole him, but he was not going to talk. That was part of his illness. And so, being in a big college, he was pushed to be interactive, to be social, to talk in his classes, and that anger about being pushed to talk built up, built up, built up. He was finally sent to have a mental health evaluation to see if he was dangerous. The court found him to be severely mentally ill and dangerous. Court ordered him into therapy, but he did not follow through. And that became, actually, I'm supposing that the evaluation for mental illness became his flashpoint. And the fact that he did not follow through to get treatment, all they did was upset him by doing the evaluation and not following through.
Now, what about a serial killer? Someone like Ted Bundy. What is because what you're describing here, these aren't serial killers. These are, if I understand correctly, single acts with many victims. In the Ted Bundy case, it was single victims, but repeat, repeat, repeat. What's the difference?
And so there you're talking about a serial murderer. And a serial murderer very often falls in the chronic category. And so they have had In fact, they're looking now at a very old case for Ted Bundy that they think that it's a murder he committed when he was 16 years old. And so if you look back in the histories of the serial murderers, very often they have had chronic violent acts and child abuse going back to the time when they were very young. So I would place them in the chronic violence group. And their serial murder goes on sometimes for years.
Now, this is a little bit gruesome, but when you're talking about these actors or these perpetrators, torture also seems to be a component of what they're doing. What is the difference in their minds between the torture and the killing?
There is a subgroup of murderers that are sadistic. Now we're talking about a whole different category of people because they enjoy hurting other people. These are people that do not have an adequate, and I'm being technical here, but I'm going to explain it. They don't have an adequate theory of mind. And so this comes from very, very early infancy abuse and probably torture. They've probably been tortured as children. And so the theory of mind says that I understand that what's in my mind is different than what's in your mind. If you don't have a theory of mind, you assume that what's in your mind is what's in somebody else's mind. So if I am a sadist and I get pleasure from hurting you, I'm going to assume that you're getting pleasure from being hurt. And actually the sadist doesn't care, but he can't imagine that somebody else is feeling and thinking something different. And so he gets pleasure from the torture, and it's a separate category and a very small percentage of the entire group.
In your typology, then, you have the chronic group, the eruptor group, and then you have a third category.
And that is the power-driven group. And so the power-driven group, actually, the leader of the group who is power-driven may not even commit murder himself, usually a him, but he will have a group of disciples that he has trained to commit murder for him. And so if we look at Jim Jones,
Libya,
Syria, Bashar al-Assad, Hitler, we look at people who want to maintain their power over an entire group of people, and they will do this through viciousness, through killing, through whatever means necessary for them to keep their power. And so they train a group of soldiers who will kill, murder, maim, genocide, whatever it takes to keep them in power, because the fear of the rest of the community, of the Gestapo or whatever his group of soldiers are, keeps him in power and in money. Power and money.
So you've identified these three groups of adult violent people. Now, how does understanding the group in which this perpetrator falls, how does that help us come to understand and begin to reconcile the presence of violence in our 21st century lives?
We must understand, number one, what it looks like. If you're going to fix something, you have to know what it looks like. Number two is, where does it come from? And these three groups, the people in these three groups, come from very different origins. So we need to know what it looks like in order to identify the people who are in those groups. We need to know what their characteristics are and their origins to know how to intervene to keep these things from happening. And so it becomes extremely important to describe these people in detail and to look at what can be done in order to prevent them from getting to their flashpoint or from their power structure that leads them to a place where they're going to hurt other people.